Great. Well, Katina, thanks very much for agreeing to talk to our group today. So this is COM 2050 Data Use and Misuse. And I'm really pleased that Professor Katina Michael from Arizona State University has agreed to come and talk to us this morning on Uberveillance and artificial intelligence, identity, location, and condition monitoring. And I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Katina.
Thank you so much, Rob. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm giving this talk on Uberveillance and artificial intelligence, and I might take off my headset actually. And the talk will look at the antecedents of Uberveillance, a term likely you haven't heard before, and put it in the context of artificial intelligence and this process of gigifying so many of our business processes and government processes, and what the fallout from that might well be going into the future. And so Uberveillance, in summary, is the ability to garner someone's identity, their location, and their condition. And by using this sensor-based information to predict and to proactively state the context that somebody is in. So I want you to think about this. If I know who you are, where you are, and what condition you're in, I can probably infer your state of mind, and I could possibly infer your next actions. And if I couple that with behavioral data that identifies touch points, interactions, both in the cyber world and the physical world, then I can know quite confidently how you may act or react to certain scenarios. And so we've come of age when the term Uberveillance was conceived by M.G. Michael back in 2006. This big data was beginning to proliferate, but it wasn't what I would call the onslaught of the big data we have available today. So I came from industry. I was working in network planning. I used a lot of telecommunications data, both geographic information systems and also statistical data through the Australian Bureau of Statistics if I was working in Australia, and other statistical bureaus across Asia for about 6 years. And all the time I would be marrying up customer data from Telstra, for example, their product plans, our future manufacturing equipment that we would be selling to Telstra, and we'd couple that up with customer data, even the Telstra white pages at the time, even though that practice is now illegal. But I'm talking about the mid-90s to late 90s, when things started to become digital and digitized. And I'd say around 2006, we had this explosion just before M.G. Michael coined the term Uberveillance. We started to see some big public systems in the form of social media, in the form of dynamic websites, what I'd call content 2.0, more multimedia rich. And so then the harvesting began. The view of what we would do with that data began. And so Uberveillance today, in the context of artificial intelligence, which is a convergence of all of this different kind of computing stealth, is causing a conundrum. It's causing a dilemma. It's causing, can I go that far? Am I allowed to do this practice? But look, this is where I could take the business process. But as your home reading that Professor Nicholls gave to you on artificial intelligence from the Harvard Business Review stated, it is about this disintermediation. It is about the AI-fied world. It is about, do we really need humans in the loop? And what might happen when we remove humans from the loop, when we remove the oversight bodies potentially, when we remove the influence of what we call in the business world, a capability, a dynamic capability, a dynamic management capability. So we know what DCs are, We know what DMCs are. It's this injection of the human as manager to steer a business process in a particular way. But what are our bounds? Well, the law tells us what our bounds are, perhaps. Our imagination tells us what our bounds are. But deep down inside, how do we know when something is useful or really is a misuse? And I refer back to one of my lecturers at UTS when I was doing the Bachelor of IT program scholarship there back in the mid-90s, who said we could use the TV test, it smells fishy test, if I put myself and someone was recording my actual action, would that change my action? The mum test, if I was doing this in front of my mum, what would that mean? We had all of these different tests to look at legality and ethicality. So something could be legal, but unethical, perhaps. It could be legal and ethical. It could be illegal, but ethical. It could be illegal or unethical and unethical. So all of these different things I want you to think about when we go through the different case studies that I'll be sharing with you. So AI allows for the disintermediation of processes, perhaps escaping that middle person that would intermediate an agreement, a process, and it allows us now to do things that we could never do before because we have access to the data. Through the explosion of information around about the time of Web 2.0, we had the explicitness of what was in here being blurted out in the online world. So previously we'd take family photos, but we wouldn't share them online. We certainly wouldn't share them with strangers. But it has become a normalized activity where I say what I'm doing. I go to a public website with a public persona that I've possibly curated in a particular way. Katina the academic, Katina the family person, Katina the one who has a community interest in privacy, for example. But we manage these different profiles, but how much we manage them is really an interesting thought. I think many times they manage us. And if you just go cold turkey, as I've done a little bit since November, you start to realize how much you have shared online. My personal website, katinamichael.com, will show you the depth and the breadth of my work over the last 15 years. But it also has some personal things on it. So it's there to be utilized. It's there to be managed. It's there to be placed into some kind of machine learning algorithm. It's there perhaps for the government to say, oh, this Katina Michael is an individual. We want her to vote for us next election. I think I'll web scrape whatever I can in an offshore organization. And maybe I'll use the electoral roll as I am a political party and maybe marry up that data with her in a subject record and figure out what her sentiments might well be. And I can do that now through text. Increasingly, we have image analysis tools that allow us to look at images to denote what is happening. And even more so, what we all should be thinking about is the video analytics that is taking place, which I talked about back in 2013, particularly when we look at deep fakes and tampering, but that's another issue. The main issue I want to get through to you today is if you're a business entity or a government agency, these two stakeholder types, what are the limits of the potential use of data? And when do we say it's misuse? When do we say we're pondering or we're teetering on Uberveillance? And so I've got a short presentation and then I'll go into a discussion. So my journey began in 1994. And for over 20 years, I've been collaborating with MG Michael, where we've been formally researching the social implications of microchipping people, something that seemed quite bizarre to most people when I began my thesis. But my honors thesis in my undergraduate degree was actually on the potential to look at embeddable devices and what that might mean for identity. And I found this wonderful lady, Professor Jennifer Edwards, who was a wonderful researcher at UTS. She's still at UTS as a professor emeritus. And at the time I was working in Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture. And I was offered a job actually with Arthur Anderson, which I declined to do further study, would you believe? So I went to the Anderson Consulting library And I wanted to see what data was available on this idea of microchipping people. Believe it or not, I got support from the Anderson Consulting librarian who says, I think I found something for you one Sunday. And I was in there most weekends for that 6-month internship. And later on, while I was doing my PhD, the company I worked for, Nortor Networks, for 6 years, a global manufacturer of telecommunications equipment, sponsored the first Cyborg 1.0 experiment, which was an implantable experiment. And at the time, our CEO, John Roth, was telling us, well, we've created smartphones, and there was a Nortel Networks smartphone. He said, we're going to stop manufacturing the smartphone because I believe it won't be too long before we have brain-to-brain interfaces. And lo and behold, today, we are seeing the beginnings of murmurings about that. But I want to basically say to you that the human metaphor that was defined by an internal employee of Anderson Consulting, and here are some internal documents that I can only show you now because the company does not exist. The human metaphor was moving to the end of technology. What does that mean? And it was about eliminating the human-computer interface. In many ways, AI does penetrate without an implantable, the brain, because of the things that I argue in terms of its ability to know your touch points with the online cyber world. And so let's extend this and say, okay, the human metaphor is not really about the human. It's not really about the elimination of technology. It's about knowing the person within and potentially being able to predict their thoughts, their sentiments, their ideas, based on both historical data and this amazing algorithmic approach through neural networks of machine learning. I give the machine something to look at, I let it study it, and either in a supervised way or in an unsupervised way, I say, go for it. In a supervised way, it usually uses regression analysis. In an unsupervised way, it learns from the data set to determine the unlabeled and unstructured and untagged data. And so there's two different views of machine learning. Some of you may have heard of deep learning, again, but not many people are talking about the limits of these tools. But what we're going towards is almost the knowledge of what the person has within their skull, being able to be used in different business functions. For example, the marketing process, which is about price, promotion, and other Ps, the 4 Ps. It's about knowing how can I use the data that is emanating from Katina or Katina's online persona or personas to drive my next product development. So I know for a fact, if I introduce a feature to my handset, that feature will be bought by a Katina or a type of Katina. Is that okay if we're using big data for service provisioning? Is it okay if we're using big data or machine learning practices to manipulate or exploit the end user to buy more? And so I say, here are my attractive customers. Katina's a big spender. She came on last week. She did multiple purchases the week before, but I also know what time of day she comes online to buy. And so I'm going to just strategically send her a micro-targeted message about half an hour before she usually jumps online on a Friday night to do her spending therapy. And what we've found again and again, and Alibaba is mentioned in this Harvard Business Review, they are the king and kings of doing this because data is gold. I have heard senior people within the organization of Alibaba, present at data conferences and say, we're really interested in the big spenders. So the second tier service is for the rest. But when we kick in with the Pareto principle that 20% of your customer base spends 80% of your total revenue, or is responsible for 80% of your revenue, you start to realize the power of creating tiers and classifying. If any of you have ever traveled in the States, you'll know that there's a row for the gold member X, and there's a row for the platinum, and there's a row for the people who have gone and bought online for the cheapest price for the ticket. It's like 7 or 8 tiers, and my kids are scratching their heads sometimes when we're traveling to the States going, Mum, do we really need this? Can't they just call out the rows? But no, It's all got to do with the algorithms. And so when you jump online, you're just not Katina Michael or whoever you are, Rob Nicholls. You're Katina Michael with this value-laden principle behind you, the one who will spend it Friday night when we start to poke her with micro-targeted messages, the one who potentially can be an influence, an opinion leader within her peer group for brand awareness. And so, you know, if I do something on social media and it looks like Katina's endorsed this, will 20 other people go, you know, we should buy this because Katina buys it. And so we are now going from this metaphor for the computer, the human being, to the end of the computer interface. How can I get you to the end of the shopping cart as quick as I can to press that button that says, I'm buying? What processes can I cut out from that buying experience? So caveat emptor has never been more important. And I guess Anderson Consulting's view of the world was something like this. This is what the human metaphor was. Like, go and stick a cathode ray tube on top of your head. I'm not talking to just a person. Guys and girls and everyone, they knew exactly what was coming. This explosion of data, this, I'm going to take what I know and think, and I'm going to write it out as a consumer. I'm going to say whether I think this product stinks. I'm going to say whether I like something, or I've had silly thoughts this evening, or I had a date that broke up, or whatever we explicitly state online. But don't be fooled. People are watching. And this valence is what precedes the Uber, the exaggerated surveillance, the above and beyond surveillance, what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. But I'm going to say Uberveillance came a good long time before surveillance capitalism. So it's the end of the computer interface. Think about that. We are, during this COVID time, we've been talking contactless, we've been talking frictionless. And when there is no friction, we end up swiping that card faster and faster, because or a card not present. I'm doing it from my home. It doesn't feel like buying. There is no hard cash being given over to the other side. And so technology is so sophisticated, it cannot be seen. Well, that pointed to me to embedded technology. It can't be seen, it's not transferable, it's micro-targeting at its best. And it's a movement away from this notion, no, we just do big data for aggregation. We just do big data so we know what people do at collection districts or at the statistical local area or the household level. No, friends, this is now going beyond this sort of mass surveillance to this micro-targeted reaching out because I know who you are. Perhaps it's not another human who knows who you are, but the machine knows you, as one article said, better than you know yourself, because it can categorize and cluster all those transactional points that we can't even remember. We can't remember if we thumbs up something 5 weeks ago or 6 months ago or 3 years ago. But putting this data together and inferring through the patterns that are uncovered and unhidden and are invisible, the machine knows and can penetrate within. That's where I take the human metaphor. And so this is the image I really want you to take away today. These things, ladies and gentlemen, are in here. We may, for the time being, be holding something and having to enter details in. But what are we entering? It's what's in here. And so when Google says they want to be the third half of your brain, it's a fascinating slogan, the third half of your brain, because if I know how your brain works, I can push the right buttons. I can exploit you. And this is where I think we are grappling with machine learning practices. How far do I go to push the buttons, to predict? And how far is it okay because I want my business to fly and I want people to buy products that they need, rather than influencing them in a way and recommending to them in a way things that I know that they'll implicitly want. They like this, I'll give them more of this, because more of this means more sales, more attention economy, more watching, more sucked into my idea of the world. And so where are the limits? And are we going to get to a place where we say there's nothing really wrong with the use of machine learning if it helps us to do better service provisioning and infrastructure providing smart city designs, more safety, because there are so many great things about machine learning that we can see to do with limited resources, to do with energy efficiency. If we only had the capacity to come up with public interest technologies where machine learning was concerned, there'd be no problem here. But we're seeing massive discriminatory practices take place when person X is perhaps taking a rideshare to a African-American community, and so I'll hike up the price because I don't want my drivers going there. Or I've rated Katina and her kids, they're a bit loud in my rideshare. The next time I pick her up, I'm going to hike the price up because she's got a baby with a disability. Whatever. The question here is, how are we manipulating the algorithms and how are they manipulating us? So Uberveillance again, identity, location, condition, inferring situational awareness towards predictive profiling. I know who you are, where you are, when and what, a movement away from mass surveillance to Uberveillance, which then starts to question and have consequences for human rights. It's okay in the criminalization space, but hopefully not taken to the point of Minority Report where you have the cogs making preemptive choices about criminality. Think about this now in the buying experience. It's Katina, I preempt this. I've used structured and unstructured data to determine this in near real time, if not real time, to influence her decision making. And so I'm moving away from this total information awareness to the specificity of what's in your skull, what's inside this fixture here called our brain. And I'll leave you with this motif. Think about where we're going as if it was a black box recorder in your head. Professor Nicholls, whom I admire so greatly, had once sent me an article on the fight recorder that was being used by our defense forces, a little device placed on the back of a helmet or on the back of a backpack that would be able to support the defense personnel, army officer, for example, in knowing where they were located to support the management of troops. And this was a test case. But that article he sent me hasn't really gone from my mind, except that MG Michael and I were talking about embedded devices. Why carry something that's transferable when something like this could be potentially implantable? Katina's black box, Rob's black box, your black box, and what does that denote about patterns of movement, including the trade-off between convenience and care and control and even safety? Now, where Uberveillance was ahead of its time was in the definition of the access of access. This is before we had deep fakes and disinformation happening rife with social media. MG Michael said there are 3 fallouts: misinformation, the misinterpretation of data, and perhaps the worst one of them all, information manipulation. I misinform you deliberately. That's data misuse. I misinterpret the data. That's not deliberate, it's accidental perhaps. But then I infer that you're something. For example, you've bought a book for a friend and that book happens to be a bestseller for the gay and lesbian community. The system infers you yourself are gay or lesbian. And the system has been wrong in its interpretation of your buying behavior. This was an example that was actually published in 2004, I think, as an Amazon fallout back then. And then information manipulation, which is like the deliberate misuse. And so what we're going to find with machine learning and AI as we progress down this path, and I'm not going to say of implantables, just knowing more about the consumer's mindset and context, is how much of it will be accidental as opposed to deliberate. As an employee, as a programmer, as a lawyer, as a business process guru, where do I sit? And when do I say, now this is becoming a little bit uneasy for me? How do I manage these dynamic capabilities? For example, in the field of management, if I'm a manager, and how do I ensure my customers are not purposefully manipulated for the sole practice of profit maximization? Now, I'm going to share screen very quickly and allude you to an article, just find it, that came online for the South Australian government. And last week, I was interviewed by ABC Adelaide and South Australia around the potential use of a platform called Nation Builder. Nation Builder is a one-stop shop, integrated, unified communication, messaging, and website system that was used during Trump's election campaign, was used during Brexit 2016, was even used locally in New Zealand for the 2017 successful election of Ardern. So what we are seeing is that the majority of political parties and government agencies are relying on this Nation Builder platform that was built by Mark Zuckerberg's roommate at Harvard. And he studied organization, but he also studied things to do with how do we take electoral rolls, how do we take publicly available data that consumers and citizens post online, and then how do we take sentiment analysis of different touch points, perhaps, as they are interacting with the government website. In this case, it was the Prime Minister and Cabinet website. Somebody noticed in the status bar at the bottom a redirect to Nation Builder, and everything pretty much erupted about 48 hours ago. Steve Marshall, the state premier, had to come online. The state ombudsman came online. I had a go at talking about what potentially might be happening, and it may well be innocent. The Liberal Party may well be using the website to facilitate the dynamic release of media releases as they are in government. But the other possibility is that they're conducting data harvesting. And so where do we say enough is enough if this is the practice which is currently being investigated? When do people have consent? When do they have transparency? When do they know that data is being cookified or datafied about them? How is that data being used to manipulate their sentiment? And so with 1 minute to go, I want to expose you, and I'll put this in the chat to wrap up. I also want to expose you to this notion of how much of higher education can be automated. As you've all gone through this with Professor Nicholls and myself as faculty, it's a striking story that I respond to, written by Indian Shiv Ramdas, who talks about the trolley solution, where a college professor is pitted against an AI machine. The machine's called Ali, and the professor is supposed to have a go at competing with Ali for the best kinds of scores for the students. But again, it's about this disaggregation, this disintermediation, this versus this. And I'm going to finish by saying to you, I'm not here to demonize technology. It's never this or this. It's this which we love, and how can we place some kind of regulatory bounds around it so that we can exploit it for good and not harm people. So with that, I'll stop and say thank you for the opportunity to talk and place some links in the chat and just hear from you as we're closing, Rob.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Katina. That was really excellent, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm really looking forward to working out whether I'm still going to be here next week or whether I'm going to be replaced by AI. So I'll have a look at those Slate articles, and I'll also note that both major political parties in Australia use that same system. So there could be either there. So thanks very much. We're actually at time. So would I suggest, if there are any questions that you've got for Katina, if they're burning questions, pop them in the chat box now. Otherwise, we might collect them, and I might invite Katina back to have a chat about them in the future, if that's okay with you, Katina. Otherwise, I'll see you, as I said, other than having been replaced by an AI, at 10 o'clock next Thursday. Enjoy your long weekend. It's public holidays on Friday and Monday here and throughout the whole of Australia. And thanks very much indeed, Katina. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely long weekend. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thanks.